Hey everybody, tonight's video is called The Slain Wicked, and tonight we continue our pass-through study here in the book of Ezekiel, where we're looking at the marking for preservation and marking for judgment. So we are in Ezekiel chapter 9, and it's actually a very short chapter. It's only 11 verses. So Ezekiel 9:1 opens, "Then he called out in my hearing and with a loud voice, 'Let those who have charge over the city draw near, each with a deadly weapon in his hand.'" So God summoned his servant angels to carry out his judgments. And the angelic executioners are seen in the next book of Daniel, chapter 4, verse 13, Daniel 4:17, and Daniel 4:23. And they came equipped with weapons of destruction. And to make a quick message here, my friend Brian Peckham is actually doing Facebook Live study on Saturdays around noontime every week on the book of Daniel. So feel free to check that out if you want to dig into Daniel. And the nation's idolatry would not go unpunished. And we see that these 6 men are armed with a battle axe in their hand. And now we can't fully understand this, that sometimes angelic beings have or desire assignments related to places or to geography. And this is true of both faithful and fallen angelic beings. And in Daniel's day, a demonic spirit was assigned to Persia in Daniel 10:13 and Daniel 10:20, as well as Greece. And Daniel chapter 12 verse 1 shows that Michael had some responsibility regarding Israel. And in Isaiah 14, Satan was connected with the king of Babylon. And in verse 2, Ezekiel 9:2, "And suddenly 6 men came from the direction of the upper gate, which faces north, each with his battle axe in his hand. One man among them was clothed with linen and had a writer's inkhorn at his side. They went in and stood beside the bronze altar." So angels can appear like men when ministering on earth, as seen in Genesis chapter 18 verse 1 and Daniel chapter 9 verse 20 through 23. And the one man was superior to the others. And linen indicates high rank, as seen in Daniel chapter 10 verse 5 and Daniel chapter 12 verse 6. And perhaps this was the angel of the Lord. And if you're in my study group on Thursday nights, we've talked about the angel of the Lord. We've also talked about the angel of the Lord here through our Old Testament studies in the past few years. And so the angel of the Lord, capital A isn't for angel and capital L for Lord, is speaking about the pre-incarnate Christ. And he had all the instruments of Oriental scribe to carry out his task. In linen garments, they were seen as holy and therefore worn by angels and those that were in the presence of God, as well as the priests back in Exodus 28, verse 31 through 42. And the bronze altar in the outer courtyard is where the sacrifices are offered. In verse 3, "Now the glory of the God of Israel had gone up from the cherub where it had been to the threshold of the temple. Then he called to the man clothed with linen, who had writer's inkhorn at his side." So the glory of the Lord departs before the destruction of the city and the temple. And the gradual departure of God from his temple is depicted in stages, that the glory resides in the temple's most holy place, between the wings of the cherubs on each side of the Ark of the Covenant over the mercy seat, and then leaves to the front door, later to the east gate by the outer wall, and then finally to Mount Olives to the east, having fully departed. And the glory will return in the future kingdom of the Messiah, as seen in Exodus chapter 43, verse 2 through 7. And that's going to be where we'll look at that back in probably right around later March, April-ish. But also my friend Brian Peckham is also doing a study on Monday and Tuesdays on Facebook Live at 3 p.m. typically on the millennial kingdom as well. So feel free to check out his studies. In verse 4, and the Lord said to him, go through the midst of the city, through the midst of Jerusalem, and put a mark on the foreheads of the men who sigh and cry over the abominations that are done within it. So since God's departure removed all protection and gave people over to destruction, it was necessary for the angelic scribe, also known as the angel of the Lord, capital A for angel, capital L for Lord, to mark for God's preservation of the righteous who had been faithful to him. And those left unmarked were subject to death in Babylon's siege. And the mark was indication of the elect of God, identified personally by the pre-incarnate Christ. And he was marking the elect as seen in Exodus 12, verse 7. In Malachi chapter 3, verse 16 through 18 indicates a similar idea. And the marked ones, they were the ones that were repentant and were identified for protection. And here was a respite of grace for the remnant. In verse 5 through 7 will show the rest were to be killed. And so, for no further ado, verse 5 through 7, to the others he said in my hearing, go after him through the city and kill. Do not let your eyes spare, nor have any pity. Utterly slay old and young men, maidens and little children and women, but do not come near anyone on whom is the mark. And begin at my sanctuary. So they began with the elders who were at the temple. And then he said to them, defile the temple and fill the courts with the slain. Get out. And they went out and killed in the city. So as in the first Passover, all who were unprotected, regardless of women and children, would be destroyed. And normally ancient people were careful not to defile the sacred ground of the temple by allowing executions of people to take place there. But 2 Kings 11 verse 15 and 16 shows Queen Athaliah was dragged outside of the temple before her execution as an example. However, we saw that the temple had already become so defiled by the sins of the people that the Lord himself gave the command to defile the house with executions. And once the Lord's presence has departed, the temple is an empty shell. And we see the fulfillment take place in 2 Chronicles 36 verse 17. And God decrees that judgment should begin there. So judgment begins at the house of God. And we're going to actually look at that a little more in our wrap-up today. And so verse 8, it says, so it was that while they were killing them, I was left alone, and I fell on my face and cried out and said, oh, Lord God, will you destroy all the remnant of Israel and pouring out your fury on Jerusalem? So Ezekiel is fearfully aroused in prayer because of the judgment on Jerusalem and Israel is so vast. And God replies that pervasive sin demands thorough judgment, yet comforts him by the report that the faithful had been marked to be spared. And Ezekiel was not told how many had been marked, but Ezekiel showed desperation, begging God not to destroy the remnant as he poured out his fury on Jerusalem. And so verse 9 and 10, it says, then he said to me, the iniquity of the house of Israel and Judah is exceedingly great, and the land is full of bloodshed, and the city full of perversity. For they say, the Lord has forsaken the land, and the Lord does not see. And as for me also, my eye will neither spare, nor will I have pity, but I will recompense their deeds on their own head. So the prophet elaborates on the violence and the lawlessness mentioned back in Ezekiel chapter 8 verse 17. And God reminded Ezekiel what he had been preaching as terrible as the judgment was, it was actually fully deserved and a long time and coming. And God brings up Ezekiel 8:12 with what the leaders of the city said earlier in Ezekiel's vision. And our last verse of the chapter, verse 11, says, "Just then the man clothed with linen, who had inkhorn at his side, reported back and said, I have done as you commanded me." So one thing we should know about angels, is that angels are diligent and accountable in their service. And the angel could report that he had marked the faithful remnant in Jerusalem. So to wrap up today's study, we looked at tonight the angelic judgment upon Jerusalem with the 6 men beside the bronze altar. And we discussed the angelic beings with assignments, whether desired or they have it. And I want to look at another example we didn't cover when I was giving you the examples through Daniel and everything. We're going to look at Mark chapter 5. So Mark chapter 5, verse 10. It says, "Also he begged him earnestly that he would not send them out of the country." So when you read Mark chapter 5 here, the demons wanted to stay in one place and not be sent to another by Jesus. So they have their interests in geological locations. In verse 3 and 4 of Ezekiel 9 showed us the command to mark the foreheads of the godly men in Jerusalem. And later on in the book of Revelation, the Apostle John speaks about the marking of the heads as well. And it will be Revelation chapter 7, verse 3. And I'm going to do my famous back it up a verse. We're going to look at verse 2 and 3. It says, "Then I saw another angel descended from the east, having the seal of the living God. And he cried with a loud voice to the 4 angels to whom it was granted to harm the earth and the sea, saying, Do not harm the earth, the sea, or the trees, till we have sealed the servants of our God on their foreheads." So God's servants are described by the Apostle John as sealed on their foreheads as well in his revelation. But we also see in Revelation 13:16, it says, "He causes all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hand or on their foreheads." And I'm going to do my famous, let's go past that verse. Verse 17, "And that no one may buy or sell except one who has the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name." So we see a satanic counterfeit that the Apostle John speaks about, identifying allegiance to Satan and his false Messiah. In verse 5 through 7 of Ezekiel 9 shows the command to kill in judgment. And we talked about how judgment begins at the house of God. And the New Testament actually mentions the same. Now I want to look at 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 17, with what Peter said. So it says here, "For the time has come for judgment to begin at the house of God, and if it begins with us first, what will be the end of those who do not obey the gospel of God?" So Paul applied it in the new covenant. And we see Ezekiel's grief in verse 8 detailed to us in Ezekiel 9:8. And Ezekiel 9, verse 9 and 10 is God's explanation of why what's happening is happening. And the chapter ends with the report of a man with the inkhorn. And I want to look at one more verse before we call it a study here. John chapter 17. And this is actually the Lord's Prayer. I know many people think the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 6 is the Lord's Prayer. That's the model prayer. This is the Lord's Prayer in John 17. And we'll look at verse 4. "I have glorified you on the earth. I have finished the work which you have given me to do." So Jesus declared the words of Ezekiel 9:11 during his prayer to the Father in John 17. And so that's going to wrap up our study today. I hope to see you next, as we'll be looking at our next Topical Saturday on Saturday. So I hope you have a great rest of your evening and a great time entering the weekend. I hope that you join us for our second Topical Saturday of 2025. So God bless. We'll see you then.